Um, so as you know, the parliamentary system in Israel is very, very different from the one we have here in the United States. And not only does a party have to have a plurality of the votes, but they have to work with coalition or form a coalition among many parties in order to have a majority of members sitting with their government. As of today, I regret to inform you there is still horse trading and jockeying for power in this Israeli parliamentary system. And we have the supreme honor of being able to bring back, by popular demand, perhaps the most wise person or among a handful of very wise people in the Israeli government who has his finger on the pulse of everything that is going on within the electoral system in Israel. And that's Alex Traiman, who is the director of and Jerusalem managing director of jns.org. Alex?
Sarah?
Yes. Hey, thank you so much. We're honored to have you back again.
Thank you guys as well. I definitely appreciate you having me back. Things are moving very rapidly here. You know, since the last time we spoke, the Israeli political system was on the brink of total implosion, right? So back then, we were then after 3 successive elections in which challenger Benny Gantz was unable to replace sitting Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. However, Netanyahu was unable to form a parliamentary majority, which means having a coalition of 61 plus members of the Knesset, just one more than half. And neither side was willing to budge. Neither side was willing to create unity with each other. And after the 3rd elections, Netanyahu received more votes than ever before, more mandates than ever before. However, he was just 3 seats short of a parliamentary majority. And in fact, the opposition was sitting with 61 seats, which included 15 from the joint list of Arab parties. We talked about that a little bit last week. The Arab parties were not willing to sit with Gantz, even though they wanted to replace Netanyahu. And even some members of Blue and White's own party were not willing to form a government that was based on support from the Arab list. In fact, Benny Gantz had also promised the electorate repeatedly, at least 25 times in the last week before the elections, that he wouldn't run to the Arab list to form a government, not a majority government with their implicit support, or a minority government with their external support. And yet, as soon as the elections were over, Gantz ran right to the Arab parties and basically caused a bit of a mutiny within his own party. And then Gantz pivoted and they said, well, okay, we're not going to form a government, but we still have 61 members of the Knesset that don't want Netanyahu to be the prime minister. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass new legislation, personal and retroactive legislation, meant specifically in order to disqualify Netanyahu from forming a government, even though over 2 million Israelis had just voted for Netanyahu and for the bloc of allies that support Netanyahu. And all those people understood that the prime minister was facing 3 separate indictments, and that the trials were scheduled to begin on March 17th, which I guess was just 2 weeks ago. Now, of course, well, we'll get to Corona in a second, but so when they wanted to pass this legislation, they needed to first grab control of the Knesset speaker's position, which was held by the very, very loyal and well-respected Yuli Edelstein. Yuli did not he opted not to hold a vote to replace himself at the time. And that led to a very contentious Supreme Court ruling in which the court basically violated the independent procedures of the Knesset and told Edelstein that he needed to hold the vote if the 61 members of the Knesset wanted it, even though the Knesset bylaws explicitly gave him the right as the interim speaker to remain in his position, and that the bylaws also explicitly state that a new vote for a speaker doesn't need to take place until the very day in which a new coalition is sworn in. And in the history of Israel's parliament, a Knesset speaker has never been voted in until a parliamentary majority was formed. So it was basically a parliamentary putsch that Gantz was trying to enact without having a formal coalition. Okay, the court then ruled that Edelstein needed to hold that vote anyway, even though they acknowledged that he was not in violation of the bylaws. He refused. He resigned his post, said, I will not hold this vote. It's against my conscience. And I think we discussed it a lot on the call. And that's on the last call. And that's basically where we left off, because the Israeli democratic system was basically shaken to its core, where the judiciary and the legislative branch and the executive branch, all three were simultaneously embroiled in this crisis now that has engulfed the nation through 3 sets of elections over the course of a year. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, we get nailed with the coronavirus crisis. And it's not just a crisis for Israel, it's a crisis for the entire world. But for the state of Israel, it is a massive crisis. Okay, and the state of Israel has taken significant steps very early on. Is the leadership of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu during this crisis, I think, is going to go down in history as being among the best in the world. He was really ahead of the curve, understood what was coming. I guess they had good intelligence from China and other places about what this pandemic actually was. They were one of the first countries to shut borders, and also one of the first countries to enforce a partial and now almost a total lockdown on the Israeli citizens. And yet, in order to govern effectively during a crisis, what you need to be able to do is to move budgets. And because Israel doesn't have a functioning parliament and doesn't have a coalition, it's impossible to change budgets. You can't add money to the healthcare budget. It's running off of the 2019 budget. And the finance ministry wants to pass a stimulus package, but there's no money for that. The government can't function properly without a coalition, without a functioning parliament. So with that, 2 members, more right-wing members of the blue and white alignment, who are Tzvi Hauser and Yoaz Hendel. The 2 of them are both former Likudniks. They both also are former advisors to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who didn't want to see Netanyahu form a government, and that is why they supported Gantz. However, recognizing that Israel was now spiraling towards a 4th election, and if you're going to go to a 4th election, the question is, well, when can you even hold a 4th election in a corona crisis? You cannot bring people out to the polls. So, they looked at some moves that Netanyahu had made in the last previous few weeks, where he pushed off his own trial because the judicial system is now not hearing new trials. They're not opening new trials, and so they accused him of subverting democracy. And there's a few different things that the opposition has done to accuse Netanyahu of subverting democracy through this crisis, but it's going to be recorded historically that Netanyahu's moves were very prescient, and yet there's really no chance that Israel could go to another set of elections in the coming weeks or even months, perhaps. So Netanyahu would remain the interim prime minister during that time, and the crisis would just continue to boil over. So what happens is that two of the, let's call them the saner members of the blue and white alignment, Tzvi Hauser and Yoaz Hendel, realized that things had gone too far. And they basically signaled their willingness to form a government or to join Netanyahu's right-wing bloc in order to form a bare majority, a very slim majority government on the right, if Benny Gantz did not agree to come into unity alignment. And this caused a massive fissure inside blue and white. And Benny Gantz was looking at internal polling that showed that in the current standoff, that many of his own supporters, many of the million-plus voters that voted for blue and white, would actually support a unity government during this crisis. And so he decided that he would be the bigger man in this mess and would join a Netanyahu-led government. The blue and white alignment basically split down the middle, with Benny Gantz and who's a former chief of staff of the IDF, and one of the other former chiefs of staff in his party, Gabi Ashkenazi, and about half of the party agreed to go into government with Netanyahu, while Yair Lapid, Moshe Yalon, who himself was a former chief of staff and a former member of the Likud party, decided to go to the opposition. They refused in any circumstances, even in an emergency, not to join with Netanyahu. And so what happens is that basically, you throw out the bathwater, but not the baby, right? So Netanyahu takes the best members of blue and white, the most stable members, and brings them into his government, and the most destabilizing members of the opposition, including Lapid and Yalon, but also Avigdor Lieberman of the Yisrael Beitenu party, the far left Peretz party, and the joint list of Arab parties all go into the opposition. So the ones that are the furthest against Netanyahu's policies go out into the opposition, while Gantz and Ashkenazi take some of the more loyal members of the party into a government. And then at the same time, the former ruling party of Israel, the Labor Party, decided to come with two of its members into government, as did the sole member of the Gesher Party who ran together with Labor. Her name's Orly Levy Abakassis. She also decided to come in. So basically, you're looking at an alignment that is around 77 or 78 parliamentarians in a Netanyahu-led government, which is a very, very large and stable center-right government. But here's the catch. Netanyahu promised Gantz, in order to get this arrangement, that he would yield the post of prime minister to Gantz after 18 months. So Netanyahu will serve as the prime minister for the first 18 months, and then in September of next year, 2021, according to the arrangement, Benny Gantz is scheduled to become the prime minister of Israel if this coalition agreement gets signed. Now, meanwhile, the big question when the deal went down is, will Netanyahu honor the deal at all, right? Maybe he'll rule for 18 months, and then just as the deadline is approaching, he'll call new elections, right? So Gantz is working now in this period of intense negotiations to get guarantees, legal guarantees, that Netanyahu will not be able to get out of his obligation to hand over the government to Gantz at the end of 18 months. But at the same time, even if Netanyahu honors his obligation to Benny Gantz and gives him the premiership in September, it could very well be that after 10 days or a month in office, that this government, which is composed of mostly Netanyahu's strong right-wing and religious bloc, says, hey, we don't want you to be the prime minister. He gave it to you, you are, but we don't want it. So we could go to elections again. So these are the types of things that are running through the minds of commentators, the opposition, Benny Gantz. And meanwhile, there is an intense period of horse trading that's taking place right now, which takes place after every election. Because as you correctly mentioned in the beginning, that we have to create a parliamentary coalition with multiple parties. And the way that this agreement comes into place is that ministerial portfolios are divvied up among the parties in the coalition. Now, what Benjamin Netanyahu promised Benny Gantz was that his party, which now has only 16 members, would receive equal representation to Likud, which has 36 members, among the ministerial portfolios that are about to be divided. And this is causing great consternation within Netanyahu's loyal right-wing bloc, because many members that were holding high-level portfolios are going to find themselves out of jobs, at least out of ministerial jobs. They're still members of the Knesset. And other loyal allies like the EMET party, led by Naftali Bennett. Right now, Bennett is the defense minister, but he is not likely to be the defense minister or even one of the senior-most ministers in a new government. The way it's looking right now is that Benny Gantz will start off as the defense minister, and that Gabi Ashkenazi would be the foreign minister. Although there are many different reports and rumors about who's willing to take what post, who's willing to give up what post to the other side. So everything that we're talking about could change and is likely to change within the next day, if not in the next hour. One of the things that Gantz is demanding is that Yuli Edelstein will not return to his previous post as the Speaker of the Knesset, because Gantz believes he should be punished for ignoring the ruling of the Supreme Court. And yet at the same time, there's many things that Netanyahu will not approve of, such as, for example, Gantz wants to control the Justice Ministry to make sure that Netanyahu cannot either advance changes to the procedures of the Supreme Court, which right now you could understand that there's probably a lot of pressure to do, even more than there was before, and also to legislate different legal maneuvers to get himself some sort of immunity. And it's believed that within the negotiations that Netanyahu is trying to figure out whether he can get parliamentary immunity now from his trials, which have conveniently for him been postponed due to Corona. And you'll remember that just before the third election, Netanyahu had taken an initiative to try to receive parliamentary immunity before the Knesset, but just before it was about to go for a vote, when Netanyahu was certain that he was going to lose it, he withdrew his request. So his immunity was never voted on in the Knesset, and there's a good chance, and Netanyahu is trying to negotiate for the opportunity to get parliamentary immunity, which is not a permanent immunity, by the way. It's a very temporary immunity, which would just postpone the trial until after he finishes serving as the prime minister. So one other important thing to note now is that what's being reported in the news, and this came through from Amit Segal on Channel 12, who has, usually gets very good information from the Netanyahu camp, is that Benny Gantz is opposing Netanyahu's policy, the policy that he wants to advance, which is to declare sovereignty throughout Judea and Samaria over every Jewish settlement and outpost, as well as the strategic Jordan Valley. And you'll remember that before the rollout, the big press conference together in the White House, Benny Gantz had a meeting with the president and the day before the press conference, and Gantz gave his tepid approval for going ahead with the first stages of the Peace and Prosperity Vision, which permits Israel to declare full sovereignty over all of the Jewish settlements and outposts in the Jordan Valley. So even though he gave his tepid approval to the President of the United States in the White House, it's being reported that he is opposing Netanyahu's policy and doesn't want to see any unilateral moves. And for Netanyahu, this could very well be a deal breaker. So even though we seem to be very close to the formation of a government, we may not have a government come out of this. And I would say that Benny Gantz is really put himself out on a ledge because he has agreed to come into Netanyahu's government in principle. He has divided the opposition in half. So essentially, Netanyahu has divided blue and white into two and created tremendous discord among all the members of blue and white, as such that they will never be able to sit together again. So he's taken this big block of 33 seats and split it into a block of 17 and a block of 16, which is way behind his block of 36. And Gantz has sort of taken all of the very generous offers that Netanyahu has given, but with each offer he's accepted, he's wet his tongue further and is looking for more and more and more and more. And it seems like Netanyahu may be getting fed up. And if that's the case, it will be Benny Gantz that will be without an opposition really to run to. I mean, could run into the opposition, but he would be in very, very bad shape, while Netanyahu would continue to be the interim prime minister with no real opportunity to hold a future election in the short term. So that's where we are. It's again still very confusing. Again, it could very well be that within an hour after this call, a coalition agreement will be signed and Israel will get to work the way it's supposed to. But it could also be that we will spin off into yet another round of the year and a half long coalition crisis.
So the drama continues. And we have not yet seen the end of this, even though, reports in the United States have said, finally, there's a unity government, there's an emergency government. It sounds like this is a never-ending saga. As the moderator, I just would like to take the liberty of asking you the first question, Alex, and that is, what happened to all of these promises that were made a week ago? For example, to the joint list of the Arab parties that they would be controlling I think it's the Health and Welfare and Pensions Committee.
The Labor and Welfare Committee,
Right.
which the reason why you're asking is because that's the committee that deals with reparations to victims of terror. Right. Now, what happened is that all of the committees were formed by blue and white as the Likud boycotted every single vote for a committee, and all of those assignments are temporary assignments, because the second there's a government, it will be the coalition that will assign new heads of all committees, and you can imagine that one of the reasons why Gantz and Blue and White did this at the time, like many of their other moves, was just to try to increase the pressure on Netanyahu, ahead of a negotiation.
Right.
But that assignment's not going to stand.
Well, I think many of us are very relieved to hear that. So now I'm going to turn the camera over to Sarah Leah Thompson, who will be reading the questions that have come in, and many, many questions have come in. Sarah Leah?
Thank you, Sarah. So our first question, why would Amir, Peretz, and Itzik Shmuley join Bibi's right-wing government?
I think it's because, look, the Labor Party this is the former party of David Ben-Gurion. This is the former ruling party of Israel. Even in 2013, the Labor Party had 24 seats, okay? And it was with the creation of Blue and White that all of the voters of Labor defected into Blue and White, because they recognized that Gantz was the one that could possibly defeat Netanyahu at the polls, and they all threw their support behind Gantz. Labor ran together in this last election together with the Peretz party and also with the Gesher party. Gesher is a center party, and Peretz is a far left party. And Labor and Peretz separately in the second election had 11 seats. When they ran together in the third election, they received only 6 seats. And now Peretz is running into the opposition. And so Labor has a choice. okay, do we either sit in the opposition, our 2 remaining seats from a former ruling party down to 2 seats, or do we take our 2 seats and try to run into the government? And for that, probably we'll get a ministry. So, considering, their weak position, it's a choice of, do they want to be irrelevant or partially relevant? And that's why they could come into the government.
Sarah, next question.
The next question. Is there any hope for pluralistic Judaism to flourish in that new government?
I think I live in Israel now for 16 years, and what I will tell you is that Israelis live the way they want to live. And there's no external or governmental pressure on citizens to live any specific type of lifestyle in the country. And I know that there's definitely a few issues, of contention that people representing the political strands of this pluralistic type of Judaism harp on, such as egalitarian prayer space at the Western Wall Plaza. There is an egalitarian prayer space at the Western Wall Plaza. In fact, it's empty almost every single day. And so I think that you have in Israel a rapidly growing population of religious, and even ultra-Orthodox Israeli citizens that demand representation in the Israeli government and have been very loyal to the Israeli government. In fact, the health minister of the Israeli government is Yaakov Litzman. He's going on almost daily with the prime minister on these press conferences. And I don't think that there is the type of mass religious coercion that many people accuse of when they ask questions about will pluralism flourish in Israel. Any type of Judaism flourishes in Israel, and you just look at the population, the overwhelming majority of Israeli citizens are not religious. They just live a secular but traditional lifestyle.
Sarah, next question.
Thank you. Next question. Once coronavirus is over, will Israel in the Bibi/Gantz Israeli politics make strange bedfellow partnership? Will they block, tear down, or let Jews build?
I'm not sure I totally understand. I know that the reason why this government is, one of the main reasons is to deal with Corona. That's really the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. Again, Gantz and Netanyahu both gave their approval of the annexation or application of Israeli sovereignty in the White House to the President of the United States. So I think we can imagine that one of the reasons why Netanyahu wants to remain prime minister is to be able to implement this application of sovereignty. And yes, I do believe that he will try to do that even before the Corona crisis ends, if it's possible to do so. And we do not know how long this Corona crisis is going to last. I mean, this is a little bit off topic, but everything that I can see from the graphs and the different linear charts that are being published, on day to day, show that the curves in every single country are just going up and up and up. And we might be in this Corona situation for many months. And if Netanyahu can figure out a way to apply sovereignty, he very well may do that, even before Corona crisis ends.
Great. I just got a question in here from the wonderful journalist and author Edwin Black, and there's been a lot of conflicting reports about how the Israeli government is dealing with the coronavirus vis-a-vis the Palestinian population and the Israeli Arab population in the West Bank and in Gaza, or Judea and Samaria, if you will. Could you help us shed a little sunlight on that, Alex?
Sure, I'll give you some media reports. The United Nations basically praised the coordination between Israel and the Palestinian Authority on how they're coordinating on Corona. However, I can tell you that just from my own building, where I'm basically in partial lockdown with my kids in a 10th story building, where I overlook, to my left, the Israeli community of East Talpiot Mizrach, Amon Hatziv, and on the right, the Arab village within Israel. It's not in the Palestinian Authority. It's part of Jerusalem, but it's still an Arab village. It's called Surbayr. And from the window, at any given time, you can see that the streets are almost empty in the Jewish side. And in the Arab village, you could see that people are driving up and down the streets like normal. Certainly there's a challenge, but I do believe that the Palestinian Authority recognizes that this coronavirus is not an Israeli conspiracy. This is something affecting the entire world, and they know that their best chance for dealing with this is to stick close to Israel and to work closely with Israel during this crisis. And from what I can understand so far, the cooperation on the security level and on the health industry levels and on the financial levels has been as good as it could possibly be expected.
Yeah, that's wonderful. In fact, even Hamas has asked its residents in Gaza to suspend their Friday March of Return, which is really exciting. Sarah Leah, do we have more questions that have come in for Alex?
Yes, we do. The next question, according to Israeli law, what legal guarantees could Gantz obtain to guarantee that after Corona, I think I lost some of the question here. We'll move on to the next one.
Wait, I think I understand the question now.
Okay, great.
So basically, I think the question is, what legal mechanisms could Gantz put into place to ensure that Netanyahu hands over the premiership in 18 months? And there's certain mechanisms that they're working on, which would involve, for example, if Netanyahu would call early elections, or if there was a vote of no confidence, that immediately that would trigger the person who had been prime minister for the least amount of time in the rotation to immediately take over, right? So that means that if Netanyahu would call an election, that would create a trigger where Gantz automatically becomes the prime minister until the election. So there's different things like that that they're working on, and all of them are completely unprecedented. Right? So these are legal maneuvers that are being invented in order to deal with such an arrangement. And it's highly unusual, especially when you look at Netanyahu holding 58 seats of his bloc and Gantz coming in with just 16 seats, that Gantz would have such leverage. But this was everybody has to pay a price in order to make a government, and this is the price Netanyahu was willing to pay.
Sarah?
Now that Bibi and Gantz have a government, can the anti-Jewish Muslim who was appointed to be in charge of reparations to the Jewish victims of terror be removed from that position?
Yeah, so I think we answered that question before, and the answer is yes, he will be removed from that position, and new committee heads will be appointed on all the committees.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Thank you so much. The next one, can you explain what happened to Ya'alon?
What happened to him? At what point? Basically, Ya'alon was the defense minister under Netanyahu for a long time. His knowledge of the Israeli security situation is probably as good as anybody's in the country, maybe even rivaling Netanyahu's himself. He was a very successful defense minister. There were different instances along the way in which Ya'alon seemed to lose trust in Netanyahu. And for Ya'alon, the straw that broke the camel's back was when Netanyahu wanted to increase the size of his government from a very narrow majority of 61 to 67, and he invited Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu party into the government. And for that concession, Netanyahu allowed Lieberman to be the defense minister and instead offered Ya'alon to be the foreign minister instead of the defense minister. And at that moment, Ya'alon rejected essentially being sacked as a very highly qualified defense minister in favor of someone who is much less qualified to be the defense minister. He didn't want to take the foreign ministry assignment, which is a much less important assignment, at least and especially in Ya'alon's eyes. And so he resigned at that point. And from then on, he just absolutely refused to sit with Netanyahu.
Sarah?
Okay, we have a couple more. I read earlier today there is so much concern from the right-wing parties that Bibi, in order for his deal with Gantz, will abandon wing ministerial positions from the right to the left. True, false, or speculation?
It's absolutely true. I think that the Yamina party, which has made several misplays during the last year. In fact, the first one, just splitting their party up in the first election, which ultimately cost Netanyahu's ability to form a government, left him one seat short of majority after the first election in last April. The Yamina has made some very, very bad political moves that have cost the right wing. Even in this last season, this last iteration of elections, they refused to sit with the Otzma Yehudit party, and they wasted 20,000 additional votes that might have been good for yet another seat, and might have put Netanyahu in the driver's seat to form a government without this protracted mess. Now, between the second and the third elections, Naftali Bennett, who made a disastrous demand for the defense ministry before the election season, which was rejected by Netanyahu, somehow or another, he convinced Netanyahu to let him be the defense minister in between the elections. And it basically is a placeholder position. And Netanyahu did that in order to buy Bennett's loyalty, to keep the bloc that we always hear about, this right-wing bloc of Netanyahu allies together during the process of the elections. However, if there's going to be any kind of unity alignment, there's no way that a party which is now the smallest party in the right wing with only 6 seats is going to hold the defense ministry and 2 other ministries. It's not going to they're not going to get the same terms that Gantz is getting for crossing over the lines and joining a Netanyahu-led government.
Sarah?
Mm-hmm. So this is a longer question. There have been a number of articles dealing with a significant displeasure with the way Yamina has not been accommodated. They currently hold 3 key ministries. How do you think the situation will be resolved so that Yamina does not take the step of joining the opposition?
I don't think Yamina is going to join the opposition. They will just find themselves out of the party. I mean, I don't mean the political party. I mean, they'll find themselves out of the party, which is the coalition. They will find themselves being extraordinarily irrelevant if they go to the opposition. They'll be sitting with the joint list, with the far left Peretz party, with Yair Lapid, with Avigdor Lieberman, and all the troublemakers. I believe that they will fall into line and join the government, but there's no way that they're going to receive the types of portfolios that they currently have. They will get portfolios, and they will get also committee chairmanships. There's a good chance that the Yamina party will get the education portfolio, which is a portfolio that the traditional Jewish right as nationalist parties have received, for many years in negotiations. Probably some deputy ministries as well. So they're just going to have to literally bite the bullet, and they're not getting hit worse than they should get hit. They're going to get exactly what's coming to them in this government.
Okay, Sarah, I think we have time for a few more questions, and they keep coming in.
They do.
We can keep answering questions. I'm
Great,
okay.
great.
Thank you. Our next question. In your opinion, will Avigdor Lieberman align with Lapid and Moshe Yaalon in opposition to Netanyahu and Gantz?
Yeah, Lieberman is going into the opposition with Lapid and Yaalon. What happens after that, we'll see.
Okay, and another question. What do you think will happen with Bibi's indictment in the next year and a half?
Well, it's a good question. The trial, which was supposed to begin on March 17th, was postponed initially until May. There's no way to know whether that trial could even possibly start in May, the way we're seeing so many different elements of our society just being shut down. There also is the chance, as I mentioned earlier, that Netanyahu may try once again to receive temporary parliamentary immunity And if he does, that would postpone any trial until such a time in which he's not serving as the prime minister. Also, it is important to note that the prime minister is the only minister in the Israeli government who is permitted by law to continue serving in his position, even when indicted, even through eviction, and until all formal appeals have been fully exhausted. So even if the trial continues, that would certainly be a media spectacle, and you could imagine that the opposition and the media and everybody will continue to go nuts on Netanyahu, but he is in the legal right to continue serving under and even if the trial begins. Oh, one other thing I can just add to that, by the way, is that one of the things that they're talking about in the negotiations is creating a framework in which Netanyahu could continue to serve in a vice prime minister or an acting prime minister role as a deputy to Gantz in the second 18 months of the government. So that's something also that's being worked on. And again, everything here is a complete and total legal and gubernatorial precedent. So there's nothing to rely on here.
Sarah?
Okay, next question. Will the new Knesset take steps to curtail interference by the courts in the decisions/operations of the Knesset?
I think that really depends on the makeup of the coalition. If Gantz and one of his partners is controlling the Justice Ministry, then I think the chances that Netanyahu's coalition will be able to advance legislation to curtail the court's authority or ability to act is going to be very limited. And in addition, considering the trauma that the Israeli electorate has just been put through, and now dealing with Corona also, if you put the legislature and the executive branch up against the judicial authority, you're going to have yet another war, a political war. And so even though it's very, very important, I believe that the authority of the judiciary, which is unelected, be curtailed, it's very unlikely that it's going to happen in the short term, especially in a unity alignment.
Okay, I think this will be our last question. Do you think Bibi can form a government without Gantz if this deal falls through?
I do believe that Netanyahu may have options to form a government if the deal falls through, and that is based on the original willingness of the former right-wingers, Tzvi Hauser and Yoaz Hendel, expressing their willingness to return to the right-wing camp and to put an end to the political standoff by supporting Netanyahu and creating a narrow right-wing majority government. So I do believe that that option remains open, and should Gantz and Netanyahu not be able to form a government after Netanyahu has offered so much to Benny Gantz to come together in this alignment, which includes giving him the ability to become the prime minister in 18 months and giving him an outsized percentage of ministries in the government, which, as we discussed before, is really causing consternation within the Likud party, within the EMET party, and others. If Gantz still refuses to play ball and to come into the government, I do think that you may see Netanyahu turn around and form a narrow right-wing government.
So the drama continues. First of all, I cannot thank Alex Traiman enough for his wisdom and sagacity, which many of us in the United States are totally oblivious of. And as I say, he has his finger on the pulse all the time. And we can't thank you enough for appearing twice within the span of a week to update us on this continuing drama of the jockeying for power within the Israeli Knesset. Please, I would love for people to support EMET, but I also would love for people to support the great work of Alex Traiman and JNS.org. JNS is a rising star in media outlets, and they have, you know, some of the best writers on the scene, myself not included. Many, many other much more brilliant people have been writing for them for many, many years, and you're absolutely doing a phenomenal job, Alex. Thank you.
Sarah, I really appreciate that, and I'll just end off on a light note, which is that with all of the sporting events in the United States and everywhere else being canceled, Israeli politics is the only game in town. So.
Right. So, you know, I don't know if this is the end, but stay tuned for the next match of the continuing sporting event of the Israeli electoral system. Thank you so much, Alex. I think we'll sign off now. Take care and stay safe.